Welcome back to Summary Central. Today we're breaking down one of the most quietly explosive philosophy books of the last decade. The Courage to be Disliked is presented as a dialogue between a frustrated young man and a calm, annoyingly wise philosopher. What they talk about will feel uncomfortably familiar because this isn't a book about abstract theories. It is about why you feel stuck, why you feel judged, why you feel not good enough, and what to do when your mind keeps replaying old stories like your life is some low-budget rerun. Part 1. The philosopher opens with a bold claim. Your life is not determined by your past, not your childhood, not your trauma, not your heartbreak, and definitely not your ex who told you that you would never change. According to him, none of that controls who you are today. Instead, he argues that people use their past as a convenient explanation for staying exactly where they are. When something is painful or uncertain, it feels easier to blame your history than rewrite your future. The philosopher calls this choosing the easiest excuse instead of the most meaningful action. The young man hates this idea. He insists his life is shaped by his experiences. He talks about childhood wounds, failures, embarrassing memories, things he believes permanently carved his personality. The philosopher listens calmly and then gently counters with the core of Adlerian psychology. He explains that human behavior is not caused by the past, it is motivated by the present. You do things because of the purpose they serve right now, not because your childhood forces you to. For example, someone might say they cannot talk to people because they were bullied as a kid. According to Adler's view, the real reason is that avoiding people protects them from risk today. The story about the past is just a shield, a way to justify staying safe. That does not mean the pain wasn't real. It means you are not trapped by it unless you choose to be. This leads to the book's first big lesson. You are living your life according to the story you believe about yourself, not the story that is actually true. And the story can be rewritten at any moment. The philosopher says freedom comes from accepting that you are responsible for your choices now, not yesterday. It is uncomfortable, but also incredibly empowering. If the past doesn't control you, then nothing stops you from changing except hesitation, which he describes as the fear of happiness. People want better lives, but often avoid the responsibility that comes with them. Because if you take ownership, you can no longer blame circumstances. Everything becomes your decision. The young man pushes back. He insists people cannot just flip a switch and stop caring what others think. And he is right. The philosopher agrees, but says approval seeking is one of the biggest prisons people build for themselves. This is where the book's title starts to hit. If you want a free life, you must build the courage to be disliked. Not because you want people to reject you, but because you must learn to stop living for their expectations. He explains this using a simple but powerful idea: the separation of tasks. Every conflict in your life becomes easier when you ask one question: whose task is this? Your job is to handle only the tasks that belong to you. Living your own life, making your own choices, taking care of your responsibilities. What other people think of you is not your task. Their approval is not your responsibility. Their reaction is not something you control. Most suffering comes from stepping into other people's tasks and trying to manage their emotions. You spend your life trying to be liked rather than trying to be yourself. The philosopher argues that when you stop interfering in tasks that are not yours, you become free. Free to speak honestly. Free to live authentically. Free to choose your path without constantly scanning the room for reactions. The young man is terrified by this, because if you stop pursuing approval, what keeps your relationships together? Wouldn't everyone start drifting apart? But the philosopher says the opposite happens. When you no longer base relationships on control or expectations, they become horizontal, not vertical. Connections built on equality, not obligation. Respect, not manipulation. This is where the book introduces an uncomfortable truth. Much of what we call kindness is actually self-protection. We smile, we agree, we avoid conflict, not because we want peace, but because we fear rejection. We maintain the image of a pleasant person because we are scared of becoming someone others might judge. And over time, this creates a false self, a version of you that is polished, acceptable, safe, and slowly suffocating. The philosopher says this false self is the real problem. It makes you live your life like a performance, always managing impressions, always editing your personality, always suppressing your real desires so you can keep your social score high. The cost is massive, because if your life depends on being liked, then you are never truly free. You are only free on the days people approve of you. And that is not freedom at all. Here the young man reaches a breaking point. He accuses the philosopher of promoting selfishness. But the philosopher says it is the opposite. True contribution comes from living authentically. When you stop performing for praise, you start creating because it fulfills you, not because it makes others comfortable. That shift turns your life from obligation to meaning. This brings us to another major lesson. All problems are interpersonal problems. Every fear, insecurity, and source of suffering comes from your relationship with others. The desire for recognition, the fear of rejection, the need for superiority, the pressure to fit in. The philosopher argues that until you confront these invisible expectations, you will always feel restricted. Real freedom is not the absence of rules. It is the courage to live without constantly seeking permission. Unchanged. Part 2. The philosopher now pushes the conversation towards something even deeper. He explains that one of the biggest sources of unhappiness is the desire for superiority. Most people would never admit it, but so much behavior is secretly driven by wanting to be seen as better, smarter, more successful, or more admirable than others. Even the desire to be liked can come from a hidden urge to be higher on the social ladder. He frames it like this. If you see life as a competition, then every interaction feels like a ranking system. Someone else's success becomes your loss. Someone else's compliment becomes a threat. Someone else's happiness becomes an uncomfortable comparison. This mindset traps people in endless insecurity. You are always trying to be enough, but the finish line keeps moving. Living this way guarantees anxiety. The philosopher offers an alternative. Instead of superiority or inferiority, choose contribution. Ask how you can be useful in your own authentic way, not how you can beat everyone else. A person who focuses on contributing does not compare. They operate from self-acceptance, not self-judgment. The young man finds this idea strange. If there is no competition, how do you measure success? The philosopher says you do not. Not in the way society pressures you to. Success is not about being above others. It is about growing within your own life. That is all. This ties into a powerful concept in the book called community feeling. It does not mean fitting into society the way others want. It means recognizing that you exist within a shared world. You are part of something larger than your own insecurities. When you understand this, your motivations shift. You stop trying to prove yourself and start trying to participate. You stop chasing validation and start building meaning. People who lack this feeling isolate themselves. They view the world as an enemy. They see life as a battlefield. The philosopher argues that this is where many emotional struggles begin. The young man pushes back. He argues that people often isolate because the world is cruel. The philosopher listens and says something surprising. He claims that many people choose isolation because relationships demand vulnerability. Being around others means facing your insecurities, confronting your fears, and risking rejection. Staying alone feels safer, but safe does not mean happy. The philosopher says people retreat from relationships not because they are weak, but because they fear responsibility. Every relationship forces you to show up as yourself. And that is terrifying when you do not like yourself. From here, the book moves into one of Adler's most challenging ideas. He says people sometimes create problems as a way to avoid responsibility. For example, a person might say they cannot pursue a career because they are anxious. According to Adler, the anxiety was created to protect themselves from the fear of failing. The purpose of the problem is to avoid action. This does not mean someone is faking their struggles. It means the mind sometimes uses struggles to hide from choices that feel overwhelming. The young man argues that this feels insulting. The philosopher clarifies, it is not about blaming yourself. It is about reclaiming power. If your problems serve a purpose, then changing the purpose can change your life. You are never stuck unless you decide to be stuck. He gives another example. Someone who says they cannot make friends might believe it is because they are shy. But the deeper reason might be that staying lonely protects them from the possibility of being disliked. Loneliness becomes a shield disguised as a wound. The philosopher is not saying people choose suffering because they enjoy it. He is saying people choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar happiness. Because familiar pain feels predictable, safe, manageable. Happiness requires movement, growth, risk. And that is what many people avoid, not consciously, but psychologically. At this point, the young man feels defensive. He insists he genuinely wants to change, but real life is complicated. Responsibilities, expectations, society, pressure. The philosopher nods and introduces one of the core themes of the book. Freedom is not the absence of limitations. Freedom is choosing your path within those limitations. You cannot control everything, but you can control the meaning you give to your experiences. You can choose how you respond. You can choose what kind of person you become. That is the essence of freedom. Then comes one of the book's most impactful shifts. The philosopher explains that people often misunderstand happiness. They chase outcomes thinking happiness comes afterward. But Adler believed happiness is found in contribution, not in achievements, not in praise, not in recognition, in doing something that matters to you, in living authentically, in connecting with others without trying to control them, in building a life that feels meaningful, not impressive. He gives the example of work. If you see your job as a form of contribution, it becomes purposeful. If you see it as a competition or a source of evaluation, it becomes stressful. The task itself does not change. Your interpretation changes everything. The philosopher says meaning comes from choosing how to see your actions. Contribution transforms ordinary life into fulfilling life. The young man admits this sounds inspiring but unrealistic. The philosopher responds with a simple challenge. Ask yourself what kind of life you want, not what others want, not what your past demands, not what society expects, what you want. Most people never ask this honestly. They follow a script handed to them, a script built on fear, approval, and comparison. That script creates misery because it was never written for your happiness. The philosopher encourages him to write a new script, a life based on his own tasks, his own values, and his own sense of purpose, not to be better than others, but to be true to himself. This is the heart of the courage the book talks about. The courage to face your own life without hiding behind excuses. The courage to let others dislike your choices if necessary. And the courage to choose authenticity over approval. Part 3. The conversation now shifts toward the idea of living fully in the present, which becomes one of the philosopher's most powerful themes. He explains that many people sabotage their own lives because they cannot stop living inside imaginary timelines. Some are stuck in the past, replaying regrets and failures. Others are stuck in the future, worrying about outcomes that have not even happened yet. The philosopher insists that the only place life actually exists is right now, not in memories, not in predictions, in the present moment where choices are made. The young man argues that the past does matter. It shapes who you are and what you can do. The philosopher disagrees again, not because the past is unimportant, but because it has no direct power unless you give it meaning. Two people can grow up in the same painful environment and choose completely different futures. What separates them is interpretation. One views the past as a curse and stays trapped. The other views it as a challenge and grows. The difference is not the past itself. It is the meaning the person assigns to it. This leads to a crucial insight in the book. The philosopher says people often cling to the past because changing their interpretation would force them to change their identity. And most people would rather cling to a painful identity they know than step into an unfamiliar identity they do not trust yet. Psychological comfort can be more powerful than happiness. The young man recognizes this in himself and becomes quiet. The philosopher then explains a key Adlerian belief. You are not determined by your past. You are determined by the goals you set for your future. But not goals like money or fame. Those belong to the world of competition. Adler meant psychological goals. The goal of contributing. The goal of connecting. The goal of living authentically. If your internal goals change, your entire personality can change. Not slowly, not gradually, instantly. Because personality is not fixed. It is a pattern you choose to continue. And any pattern can be replaced with intention. The young man asks how someone can change instantly. The philosopher gives an example. A shy person can decide to act bold, not think bold. Act bold. Behavior shifts identity. The young man argues this is unrealistic, but the philosopher explains that people already change instantly all the time. A person may act one way at home and another way at work. Another person may act brave for their child, but fearful for themselves. These are shifts in identity based on chosen goals. If you can perform different selves in different situations, it means identity is flexible, which means you can choose a new one. From here, the book introduces one of its most radical ideas. The philosopher claims there is no such thing as trauma in the deterministic sense. Not that pain is unreal, but that trauma does not decide your future. He says trauma is real, but it is not destiny. It becomes destiny only when you decide the past is the explanation for your present limitations. The young man reacts emotionally to this idea, feeling like the philosopher is dismissing suffering. But the philosopher insists the opposite. He is giving people a way out. If trauma does not decide your future, then you are not doomed. You are not broken. You are not a prisoner of your story. You can choose a new direction. The young man wrestles with this. Part of him wants to believe it. Another part clings to the familiarity of blaming the past. The philosopher says that this inner conflict is normal. Most people are afraid of freedom because freedom means responsibility. If the past does not control you, then you must take charge of your own life. That responsibility feels heavy. It is often easier to believe you cannot change than to try. Then the philosopher introduces another key theme. He says the reason people constantly seek recognition is because they believe their worth must be proven. They think their value depends on achievements, appearances, or approval. Adler disagreed. He believed people do not need to prove their worth. They need to accept it. You are worthy because you exist. You are enough without meeting anyone's expectations. When you stop trying to prove yourself, life becomes lighter. At this point, the young man asks about relationships again. If you stop seeking approval, will people not drift away? The philosopher answers with another surprising idea. True relationships are not built on the desire to be liked. They are built on equality. When two people respect each other without trying to control each other's tasks, a healthy connection forms. But when one person tries to shape or evaluate the other, the relationship becomes vertical. One stands above, the other below. This is where conflict begins. The separation of tasks becomes important again. The philosopher says you are only responsible for your own tasks, your choices, your emotions, your actions, and others are responsible for theirs. When you try to control someone else's task, the relationship becomes strained. When you let others control yours, you lose yourself. The young man begins to see how many conflicts in his life came from stepping into tasks that were not his, trying to impress people, trying to gain approval, trying to manage their reactions, trying to win arguments, trying to avoid judgment. All these are attempts to control tasks that belong to others. Letting go of this feels like a relief to him. The philosopher then expands the idea of relationships by introducing a new concept: horizontal relationships. In vertical relationships, one person tries to be superior and the other inferior. This creates tension. In horizontal relationships, both people stand side by side, equal in value, not competing, not comparing, simply existing and contributing freely. The philosopher says this is the foundation of community feeling, not obedience, not hierarchy, but cooperation. The young man asks how someone can adopt this mindset when society constantly pushes competition. The philosopher says the world will always have competition, but you can choose not to participate. You can choose your own goals. You can choose contribution over victory. You cannot control society, but you can control your orientation within it. This is where individual freedom lives. The conversation then returns to happiness. The philosopher explains that happiness is not something you chase. It is something you create by living in harmony with yourself and others. Happiness is found in relationships, but only when they are free of expectations and control. It is found in work, but only when it feels like contributions rather than obligation. It is found in identity, but only when you stop performing and start living authentically. Part 4. The philosopher now moves the conversation into one of the most misunderstood ideas in the entire book. He explains that freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. Freedom is the ability to choose your life without being controlled by fear of how others will react. Most people think they are free, but their actions are shaped by anxiety about judgment. They dress a certain way because they fear criticism. They take certain jobs because they fear disappointing their families. They hold back on dreams because they fear failing in public. The philosopher calls this living as a hostage to imagined opinions. The young man pushes back, arguing that society will always judge. The philosopher agrees, but clarifies that judgment is inevitable. What matters is whether you allow it to determine your actions. You cannot stop people from judging. You can only stop living for their approval. The courage to be disliked is not about provoking people. It is about being willing to accept the natural consequences of authenticity. Not everyone will like you. That is normal. If you try to make everyone happy, you will lose yourself. The philosopher introduces an insight that stops the young man in his tracks. He says people do not fear being disliked. They fear losing the illusion of harmony. When someone disapproves of you, it feels like conflict. Most people avoid conflict at all costs, even if it means burying their own desires. But all that does is create internal conflict. And internal conflict is far more painful. The philosopher suggests that choosing external discomfort is often the only way to achieve internal peace. This leads into one of Adler's key principles. He believed all problems are interpersonal problems. Even when you think your problem is internal, the true source often traces back to how you imagine others see you. Fear of embarrassment, fear of being judged, fear of being left out, fear of being misunderstood. So much suffering comes from constantly evaluating yourself through someone else's eyes. At this point, the young man asks a simple question. How do you stop caring? The philosopher laughs at the idea. He says, the goal is not to stop caring. The goal is to stop indulging in unnecessary tasks. You work on your tasks. You let others work on theirs. If someone dislikes your choices, that is their task. You do not interfere. The young man starts to see the relief in this. So many problems disappear when you stop trying to micromanage other people's perceptions. The philosopher then brings up a concept that surprises the young man: contribution without reward. He says the healthiest people contribute to the world without expecting praise, recognition, or repayment. When you do something kind only to receive approval, the action becomes a transaction, a bargain for validation. But when you contribute because it aligns with your values, the action becomes meaningful. He explains that this mindset removes the pressure of performance. You are no longer doing things to be impressive. You are doing them because they matter to you. This is the beginning of true internal stability. When your sense of worth comes from contribution instead of comparison, you become unshakable. No criticism can destroy you, and no praise can control you. The young man then asks a deeper question. What does it mean to live authentically? The philosopher answers simply. Living authentically means acting in alignment with your values rather than reacting to your fears. Most people live reactively. They respond to fear, they avoid discomfort, they protect self-image. Authenticity requires you to flip that. You start acting based on purpose, not fear. Vision, not insecurity. Contribution, not competition. This brings the conversation toward the nature of purpose. The philosopher explains that purpose is something you choose. It is not something you discover in a dramatic moment. Purpose is decided through action. When you contribute to something larger than yourself, purpose grows naturally. When you isolate or compare, purpose decays. He warns that people who feel aimless are often disconnected, not broken. They lack community feeling, not talent or potential. Restoring connection restores purpose. As the night continues, the young man begins to soften. The philosopher's ideas are not comforting, but they are clarifying. He starts to realize that he has lived most of his life trying to avoid being disliked. Every choice has been shaped by predictions about how other people might react. He has not been living. He has been calculating, performing, managing. The philosopher tells him that almost everyone lives this way at some point, but you can choose to stop. The conversation then shifts to why people hesitate to live this philosophy. The philosopher explains that when you change your life, it forces others to reconsider theirs. Some people do not want to see someone around them choose freedom because it exposes their own avoidance. This is why people sometimes react negatively to others' growth. Not because the change is bad, but because it highlights what they are afraid to confront. Recognizing this helps you stop taking criticism personally. The young man asks what this means for relationships. The philosopher explains that authentic relationships often become stronger when you embrace this philosophy, because instead of playing roles, you are showing up truthfully. Instead of manipulating each other through expectations, you support each other freely. Instead of competing, you coexist. And that creates stability that performance never can. The philosopher ends this portion of the discussion with a core message. Living a fulfilling life requires courage. Not the courage to fight the world, but the courage to stop fighting yourself. To choose authenticity over approval. To choose contribution over competition. To choose present action over past excuses. To choose freedom over fear. Part 5. As the discussion progresses, the philosopher shifts into what becomes one of the most important themes in the entire book. He explains that living a good life requires the willingness to be ordinary. Not mediocre, not lazy, not unimproved. Ordinary, meaning you stop trying to win every invisible competition. You stop trying to be special in ways that exhaust you. You stop trying to build an identity out of comparison. The philosopher argues that the obsession with being exceptional is one of the biggest sources of unhappiness. The young man reacts immediately. He hates the idea of being ordinary. He thinks being ordinary means being insignificant. The philosopher explains that this mindset comes from inferiority feelings. When someone constantly compares themselves to others, they resent anything that suggests equality. But true equality is not degrading. It is liberating. When you accept that everyone is simply human, including yourself, you stop measuring your worth through performance. You stop tying your value to achievements. You stop chasing superiority. And that opens up room for authentic growth. The philosopher clarifies an important distinction. Inferiority feelings are normal. Everyone has them. The problem is when they turn into an inferiority complex, which becomes a belief that you are permanently less than others, or a superiority complex, which becomes a disguise for insecurity. Both are traps. Both come from comparison. The solution is not to become superior. It is to step outside the entire hierarchy. This is where the philosopher delivers one of the most striking lines of the book. He says, "The courage to be happy also includes the courage to be disliked." Happiness requires choosing your own path, even when others do not approve. Happiness requires living in alignment, not performance. Happiness requires giving up the safety of conformity. The philosopher warns that many people do not actually want happiness. They want comfort. And those two are not the same. The young man protests. He insists he wants happiness. The philosopher challenges him. If you truly want happiness, why do you continue living in ways that contradict your values? Why do you cling to excuses? Why do you hesitate to make changes that would bring growth? Why do you prioritize being liked over being fulfilled? These questions hit the young man hard because he recognizes how often he avoids action out of fear. The philosopher explains that people fear happiness because happiness demands responsibility. If you admit you can be happy, then you must take responsibility for creating it. You cannot blame circumstances. You cannot blame the past. You cannot blame people around you. You must act, and acting brings risk, failure, change, growth, uncertainty. Many people fear these more than they fear unhappiness. From here, the conversation transitions into the idea of living in the here and now. The philosopher explains that people often believe they cannot change because they think personality is fixed. But Adler believed personality is not something you have. It is something you choose every day through your actions, through your decisions, through your orientation toward life. You are not a completed structure. You are a process. You can choose a new direction at any moment. The young man asks what this looks like in practice. The philosopher gives an example about anger. He explains that anger is often a tool, not a natural explosion. People choose anger because it helps them achieve something. Intimidation, withdrawal, avoidance, control. If you understand the purpose behind your emotions, you can choose new actions instead of reacting automatically. This does not mean emotions are fake. It means emotions respond to goals. Change the goals, and the emotional landscape changes too. The philosopher then talks about relationships again, this time focusing on boundaries. He explains that the separation of tasks is not about detachment. It is about respect. Respect for your autonomy and respect for the autonomy of others. You do not control their feelings, and they do not control yours. You support, but you do not interfere. You encourage, but you do not dictate. You connect, but you do not cling. Healthy relationships are created when both people understand this balance. The young man worries that this philosophy might create distance between people. The philosopher shakes his head. He says genuine closeness cannot come from dependency. It can only come from two whole individuals choosing to support each other freely. When relationships are built on obligation or fear, they become fragile. When they are built on authenticity and contribution, they become strong. The philosopher describes this as a shift from life as a competition to life as a series of moments for contribution. You do not need to outperform anyone. You simply need to show up as yourself. When you contribute, you become part of a larger community. And this connection brings meaning. Meaning brings courage. Courage brings freedom. At this point, the young man begins to see that the book is not giving quick fixes. It is offering a complete reorientation of how to live. A new philosophy. A new way of seeing human nature, relationships, and personal responsibility. The philosopher is not asking him to become fearless. He is asking him to act even when fear is present. He is asking him to choose growth over validation. He is asking him to accept that being disliked is not a failure. It is a natural part of living authentically. Part 6. The conversation now moves toward the final philosophical shift the young man must confront. The philosopher explains that living a fulfilling life requires a new understanding of work, love, and community. He calls these the 3 major life tasks. Most people struggle because they try to handle these tasks while still operating inside a mindset of comparison, fear, and approval. The philosopher emphasizes that the tasks of work, friendship, and love are not meant to be solved by controlling others. They are meant to be approached with contribution, equality, and authenticity. First, he addresses work. Many people see work as a source of stress, evaluation, and social ranking. How successful are you? How impressive are you? How quickly are you rising? This turns work into a constant competition that drains meaning. The philosopher suggests reframing work as a form of contribution rather than competition. When you see your work as something that benefits others, your anxiety decreases and your motivation increases. Work transforms from a battle to a channel for expression. You are not trying to outperform others. You are trying to express your strengths in a way that helps your community. This reframing shifts the emotional weight of daily life. Next, he turns to friendship. Many friendships are based on convenience or superficial connection. But true friendship, according to Adler, requires equality. Both individuals must respect each other's autonomy and support one another without hidden motives. If one person tries to control or outperform the other, the friendship becomes vertical and fragile. The philosopher explains that friendship is where most people learn horizontal relationships for the first time. Not through hierarchy, not through competition, but through genuine cooperation. Friendships built on authenticity create emotional safety. They allow you to show your real self without fear, and they are essential for developing community feeling. Finally, the philosopher addresses love, the most challenging task. Love is often distorted by dependency, expectation, and attempts to control. People confuse possession with connection. They mistake approval for affection. The philosopher explains that love can only flourish when both people stand on their own feet, when they choose each other freely, not from fear or insecurity. Love becomes unhealthy when you try to control your partner's tasks, their emotions, their reactions, their choices. Healthy love requires a deep respect for autonomy. It is two individuals walking side by side, not one pulling the other forward or pushing them from behind. The young man admits this sounds overwhelming. The philosopher acknowledges that these tasks are difficult because they require you to face yourself honestly. They require you to let go of manipulation, fear, and self-protection. They require vulnerability, and vulnerability is uncomfortable, but it is also the only path to genuine connection. The philosopher then brings the discussion back to the concept of community feeling. He explains that human beings find true happiness when they feel connected, useful, and part of something larger than themselves. Not when they are praised, not when they are envied, when they contribute without expectation, when they participate without comparing, when they stop performing and start belonging. Community feeling is not about being popular. It is about recognizing your shared humanity with others. When you understand this, you stop seeing people as competitors and start seeing them as partners in life. The young man asks how someone can develop community feeling if they have spent their whole life focused on approval or superiority. The philosopher says it begins with small acts of contribution, helping without expecting credit, speaking honestly instead of seeking praise, choosing equality instead of hierarchy. These small actions reorient your mindset. Little by little, contribution becomes natural, and comparison loses its power. Then the philosopher shares one of the most impactful ideas in the entire book. He says, the world is not a threatening place by default. People often believe that the world is full of enemies, critics, and obstacles. But this perception is shaped by their own orientation toward life. When you approach the world with the mindset of competition and fear, you interpret everything as a threat. When you approach the world with the mindset of contribution and equality, you interpret everything as an opportunity to connect. The world mirrors your beliefs about it. The young man pauses. He realizes he has spent years assuming the world was against him, that people were judging him. that life was something he had to endure rather than experience. The philosopher explains that this belief came from his inferiority feelings, not from reality. When you change your orientation, the world itself feels different. It becomes less hostile, less intimidating, less competitive, and much more open. The young man pauses. He realizes he has spent years assuming the world was against him, that people were judging him, that life was something he had to endure rather than experience. The philosopher explains that this belief came from his inferiority feelings, not from reality. When you change your orientation, the world itself feels different. It becomes less hostile, less intimidating, less competitive, and much more open. The young man pauses. He realizes he has spent years assuming the world was against him, that people were judging him, that life was something he had to endure rather than experience. The philosopher explains that this belief came from his inferiority feelings, not from reality. When you change your orientation, the world itself feels different. It becomes less hostile, less intimidating, less competitive, and much more open. The philosopher then speaks on living in the present. He explains that when you act with contribution in mind, you stop being obsessed with the past or anxious about the future. You focus on the task at hand. You show up to your life as it is happening. This is the foundation of courage. Courage is a present action. You do not develop courage by planning for it. You develop courage by acting right now, despite fear. The young man asks what the final takeaway is. The philosopher answers with calm simplicity. A fulfilling life is created by choosing authenticity, contribution, and present action. It is created by separating your tasks from others. It is created by releasing the need for approval. It is created by embracing equality and rejecting competition. It is created by living for meaning instead of recognition. And most importantly, it is created by accepting that being disliked is an unavoidable part of living honestly. The philosopher reminds him that courage is not loud. It is quiet. Courage is not about fighting the world. It is about choosing yourself every day, in small decisions, in honest conversations, in the way you show up, in the way you live. Conclusion. As the philosopher and the young man finish their long night of questioning and arguing, the message becomes clear. The courage to be disliked is not trying to make you rebellious or indifferent. It is not telling you to stop caring about people. It is teaching you to stop letting fear decide the shape of your life. Every idea the philosopher shares points toward one truth. You are far more free than you think. You are far less trapped than you believe. And the limits you feel are often the limits you have accepted. The book asks you to imagine a life where you act based on what matters to you, not what impresses others. A life where your relationships are grounded in respect rather than control. A life where you contribute because it fulfills you, not because it earns approval. A life where your worth is no longer tied to winning invisible competitions. A life where you stop performing and start living. This is what Adler called the courageous life. The philosopher reminds the young man that courage is not about eliminating fear. It is about choosing despite it. You do not become courageous by waiting for perfect certainty. You become courageous by taking responsibility for your own tasks, by showing up authentically, by accepting that some people will misunderstand you, by choosing meaning over validation, by trusting that a life lived honestly will always be richer than a life lived safely. And this is the book's final gift. The realization that happiness is not something you find. It is something you create through action, choice, and contribution. Happiness does not come from being admired or being perfect or being exceptional. It comes from living with a sense of community, purpose, and authenticity. From choosing to participate in life rather than hiding from it. From embracing your humanity instead of performing an identity built on fear. The courage to be disliked is really the courage to be yourself. Not the self shaped by fear or comparison, the self shaped by intention, the self that chooses its life. And if you build that courage, even in small steps, you open the door to a freedom you may have never experienced before. A freedom to live lightly, contribute deeply, and walk through the world without carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. Thank you for watching Summary Central. If this breakdown helped shift your perspective or gave you something to think about, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss the next deep dive. And if you want a faster version or a deeper version, check out the 15-minute and 5-minute summaries linked below. See you in the next one.